Hi, everyone. I think it's safe to start now. Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining our discussion this afternoon, in which we will tackle a very key question. What role do human rights have to play in defining a new economics? So the purpose of this conversation is to discuss the intersection between economics and human rights. As we have seen so far over the last few months, the response to the COVID-19 pandemic has really shown us that economic policies have a profound impact on the realization of rights. Yet the economics discipline, for lack of a better word, continues to be very ignorant of the implications of economic policies on people's rights. At the same time, we see that human rights advocates, while they engage deeply on the implementation of particular socio-economic rights, this has not resulted in tackling and shaping the fundamental structures of our economy. So in this webinar, we aim to tackle some of these questions as to why this is still the case. Why are economics and human rights not more, the fields are not more intersectional? So this webinar has been organized by the Institute for Economic Justice, the IEJ, partnering with the Center for Economic and Social Rights, CESR, which is based in the US, and Section 27, based in Johannesburg. So as organizations, we all work on socioeconomic rights realization, both locally and internationally. We will hear more from the organizers very shortly. But first, I want to introduce our four amazing panelists. I'll start with Professor Sandra Liebenberg. She's a professor at Stellenbosch University and vice president at the United Nations Committee on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Followed by Professor Pandey Pillay, who's a professor of economics and public finance at the School of Governance at Wits University. Dr. Basani Baloyi is an economist at Oxfam, South Africa. And last but not least, Jason Brickhill is a public interest lawyer and is currently doing his PhD at Oxford University. So I'd just like to thank the panelists for joining us. So we'll discuss with each panelist questions on the role of socioeconomic rights within the economics field, as well as in economic policymaking in general. More specifically, we'll discuss how to bring the fields together, both conceptually and in practice. I would like to hand over to Daniel McLaren from Section 27, who will give some input on the role Section 27 has played in organizing the event. I'll also give a brief background on why IEJ has felt this was an important project to embark on. But first, Daniel McLaren, you have the floor.
Okay, thanks, Pam. And yeah, so I'm a budget analyst at Section 27, and we involved with this project with the IEJ and with the Center for Economic and Social Rights in New York, because in the work that we do as a public interest law organization in the health and education, questions of resource allocation are becoming more and more central in all of the work that we do. In the overall budgetary environment, fiscal environment, there's a drive towards fiscal consolidation, and healthcare and education, and as well as other socioeconomic rights, are being directly impacted by funding shortfalls and budget cuts. So we see this in schools, which we represent, and we see this across the health system as well. So for us, it's very important that the normative standards which have been developed by human rights practitioners to build a plethora of rights entitlements for people are not just ridden roughshod over when there is a fiscal deficit or an economic regression. That the those norms and standards also make it into economic and budget policy making processes. So we are really interested to see how both economists and human rights practitioners think we can move from a place where often funding cuts are made with little recourse for rights holders to a place where budget and other economic policy making processes are more informed by fundamental human rights, which people are entitled to. So we're very interested to hear the conversation and to build this directly into our work going forward.
Thanks, Daniel. I think similarly to the to Section 27, the IEJ also has embarked on this project as a broader aim to generate ways in which human rights advocacy can feature more strongly in economic policy, and how economic policy making can utilize more effectively and more deeply the human rights framework to shape approaches to creating a just economy. So we've been doing this in various ways. This particular discussion, we hope to have to bring people together to talk about and to work on the intersection between economics and human rights. But we've also aimed to incorporate this thinking into our other projects. Daniel has mentioned budgeting, for example. We're part of the Budget Justice Coalition, which is part of our budget justice work. And also we also aim to incorporate this in our other projects such as climate justice and our feminist economics work. Thanks, Daniel. We'll also hear from Ignacio from the Center for Economic and Social Rights a bit later on at the end of the discussion. He will give some reflections on the discussion in general. But for now, I guess I'll start by handing over to Cariee to initiate the discussion. Cariee is a researcher at the IEJ. So over to you, Cariee.
Thanks, Pam. Thanks for that introduction. So as I think you're all aware, we're going to try to structure the webinar today around a conversation. So as I said in the chat, we really encourage you to post questions in the Q&A box and to post any comments on the chat. And we'll try to weave those in as much as possible. So please keep coming throughout, and the panelists will also try their best to monitor the Q&A throughout the webinar. And so I think what we'll do, and for those of you who don't know, the process leading up to this webinar and some of the engagements we're going to have following it have involved a number of different interviews that Pamela and I have done with various people who work in these two fields and some people who are trying to bring these fields together. And so some of these questions that we're going to discuss today are kind of based on some of that research. As Pam said, the COVID-19 moment, I guess it's become almost cliche to start off with saying something like the COVID-19 moment has shown us why this is really important. But I think that it really has shown why trying to develop a new economics and why an economics based on rights is really important. So I think that we should really kind of center this conversation in the current moment and what's needed going forward. And our interviews have really shown that there's potential for a very rich and diverse conversation on these questions. So I really hope that we'll be able to do that today. We're going to try to structure the conversation around kind of three broad areas. So we'll start off trying to map the conceptual, theoretical, historical developments in this field, especially as it pertains to South Africa, but trying to anchor that in global conversations. And we'll follow that with speaking about some of the kind of tactics and then some of the strategic entry points that we need to develop this field further. And as I've said to the panelists, they're going to feel free to kind of jump in where they can, even though I'm going to direct the conversation at some of them. So we hope this can be very interactive. So I'd say in terms of the first, in talking about conceptual and theoretical and historical developments, we sort of found that there were two broad trends that came out in our research. So from a human rights perspective, we've seen the way in which socioeconomic rights have become increasingly important in the South African context in the post-apartheid period. But however, a number of people pointed out that whilst we've seen this development and we've seen these becoming more and more important, they have not typically tackled systemic issues. So these have been quite focused on narrow and individual rights, and that's been a major trend that we've seen. Similarly, from an economics perspective, we have seen that it's not only mainstream economists that don't integrate rights into their research and policy making. Many progressive economists have also been reluctant to integrate the notion of human rights, and that's for a number of different reasons. Partly that's because they might not see them as being radical enough, that they've often seen them as being too limited on kind of individuals and not dealing with the systemic issues. And in other parts, they just haven't been exposed enough to them, and people have a kind of a lack of familiarity with rights. So those have been two big trends that we've seen overall, and we're going to try to unpack some of that in the beginning. What we have seen, however, is that globally this has been changing, and that there are more and more people trying to make the case for an integration of these two fields. So to kind of unpack a little bit of that, we're going to start with asking Professor Liebenberg to respond to the question about what are the main trends in the development of socio-economic rights in the post-apartheid context in South Africa.
So thanks very much, Cariee, and please call me Sandy, everyone. So yes, I think you've sketched in broad brushstrokes, you know, this importance of interaction between these two fields. And I think it's useful to go back to the drafting of the 1996 Constitution, where the inclusion of socio-economic rights in the Constitution, along with environmental rights, access to land, and so forth, were very contested. And there was this huge cross-party mobilization and cross-civil society mobilization for economic, social, and cultural rights in the Bill of Rights. And the important point, I mean, it was an enormous achievement because historically these rights have been marginalized in human rights discourse and have essentially been regarded as, you know, on the margins of mainstream discourse. And they've been relegated to the so-called private sphere of the economy and the family. And this has had huge repercussions in terms of deepening gender inequality, because when the state doesn't take responsibility for social provisioning, it is usually women, because of the gendered burden of care, that pick up the slack. It's had huge implications in terms of deepening inequalities, global economic inequalities. It's also systematically reinforced racial injustices and dispossession. So it was a major achievement. The significance of having these rights in the Constitution and of all rights is that rights connect to accountability. So if you have a right which doesn't have a remedy or some form of accountability, then that is essentially a paper tiger. It's pretty meaningless. So the Constitution for Human Rights then creates a range of accountability mechanisms. We have the courts, we have the legislature who's supposed to implement rights, give effect to rights. The executive is meant to formulate policy regarding rights, administration to implement rights. You have your Chapter 9 institutions, Human Rights Commission, Auditor General, Public Protector, and so forth. So a major inspiration also, and I think this is a conversation that has come a long way, is that a major source of inspiration for our socio-economic rights in the Bill of Rights was the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. So although not identical, many of the concepts, such as progressive realization within available resources, drew inspiration from this covenant. which South Africa only ratified in 2015 and has just been through its first major review of the Committee on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, litigation and advocacy has been far-reaching. There have been many gains made, but also there have been setbacks, both in campaigns and in court cases, and I can discuss that more if we've got time. But there's also been significant, I think, victories in which the courts have formulated a number of doctrines which I believe in this conversation and in looking at how rights and the economy can connect, establish these points of connection. And I'll just mention a few of those. For example, the notion that rights, that the reasonableness of the measures government takes should not be measured in terms of the aggregate improvement in the level of rights, but must also take account the value of human dignity and the needs of those most marginalized. So it's no good if government says over 10, 12 years, there'll be an improvement in housing delivery if immediately people are living on the streets or without access to land or housing. So I think this is a very important doctrine. Furthermore, the notion of progressive realization, which is often seen as a shield for government, but can also be a powerful tool to be wielded to say that actually rights need to progressively improve people's living conditions, and we need to move forward, which includes a presumption against cutting back or moving backwards, so-called retrogressive measures. And I think in his introductory remarks, Daniel highlighted very much the whole notion of retrogression brought about by austerity and fiscal consolidation policies. Also connected to our socio-economic rights and our strong substantive equality clause in the Bill of Rights is the notion that there shouldn't be any direct or indirect discrimination. And this has been bolstered by legislation such as the Promotion of Equality and Prevention of Unfair Discrimination Act, which covers a range of sectors and has also critically recognized socioeconomic status as a potential ground of discrimination. And then there's, I'll end this off by saying, you know, there's also a whole lot of process requirements that are important. For example, the idea that there should be meaningful engagement in processes designed to realize rights, that rights realizing policies should be transparent. There's a range of jurisprudence, and these all connect to many international doctrines and doctrines in other countries which have been used, for example, in the wake of the financial crisis of 2007-2008 to challenge fiscal austerity measures with mixed success, it has to be said, and with many of the systemic questions about our economy still not having been fully grappled with in the human rights arena. So Cariee, I think with that sort of Cook's tour of the field, I'll leave it at that, but I hope I've given a sense of the trajectory. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. That was very useful. I wondered if I could just ask a quick follow-up question to that. So in your submission, you spoke about the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights and South Africa's ratification, and then the fact that South Africa has just undergone this process to kind of evaluate their compliance. I don't know if I'm using the right words because I'm not a lawyer, their compliance with the treaty. And I think those concluding observations are incredibly useful for anyone who wants to work on socioeconomic rights and people who are interested in economic policy. At the IEJ, we've started using those, I think, they've been very helpful to us in our advocacy work around, rights at work, around the use of maximum available resources, and all of these other things. We're really trying to kind of bridge these two things. Could you just talk briefly a little bit about what that process is about, and what the kind of, for people who don't know what concluding observations are, what they kind of entail and what their status is?
Thanks very much, Cariee. So basically, all the human rights treaty bodies at regional and international level monitor how state parties fulfill their obligations through a periodic reporting process. That's one mechanism. There's also the availability of individual complaints, but the state parties have to accept that sign-on mechanism. And for the Covenant on Economic and Social Rights, it only got the optional protocol for individual communications very late in the day. It came into force in 2013, and South Africa has not signed on to that individual justiciability mechanism. So individual or group complaints are not an option. So that reporting procedure is the only monitoring option. And as you mentioned, South Africa went through its initial review. Many parties were in this webinar were actually involved in it by doing civil society parallel reports. South Africa reported on its implementation of the covenant, and at the end the committee gives an assessment of how, in their opinion, what are the main achievements, what are the main concerns, and what are the committee's recommendations. And I think importantly for our conversation, the committee made some very strong recommendations on maximum available resources, highlighting the huge wealth gap in the country, income inequalities, as well as a development pathway which they criticized as insufficiently inclusive, and also had a specific paragraph dealing with austerity measures and their impact on human rights, and a set of recommendations. They also dealt with a range of other fields, such as the gap in social security, which exists, the chasm between the end of the child support grant and the kicking in of the old age pension scheme, the fact that effectively there's no social security for people who are structurally unemployed in the country. So essentially, the status of those general comments, they are not in and of themselves legally binding documents, but they have enormous persuasive value because they are the opinion of the official body which has been elected to assess and interpret the covenant. And also they can be taken up in domestic law by the courts. So courts across the world have sometimes referred to general comments of the committee or concluding observations and used them in support of their opinions. So they are sort of so-called soft law status, but nonetheless they indicate the authoritative judgment of a expert, independent international body of 18 experts from across the world assessing South Africa's economic policy and human rights trajectory. So thanks. I hope I've answered that question.
Thank you. And there's a couple of questions coming through in the chat for you, but I think what I'll do is come back to that in our next section because they fit quite well into that. So I'm going to ask a question of Professor Pandit Pillay, which is to try to bring in this question of economics and economic policy. And I think what's really important is for us to try to expand this conversation about the link between rights and the economy, also to be not just about budgets, but about the kind of underlying theoretical and conceptual framework that informs the economic discipline. So what I'm going to ask you, Professor Pillay, is how would you characterize the status of rights within the economics profession, both in terms of policy and in academia or in research?
Well, thank you very much. Well, my short answer would be that at best, it's implicit in the work of economists in the country. But I think it varies considerably depending on which group of economists or researchers that you are referring to. And I want to maybe talk about them in 4 groups, starting with the private sector. And I think it's stating the obvious by saying that the private sector have no concern whatsoever with socio-economic rights. There is a very narrow view of economics there that has a certain, well, a serious obsession with economic growth and nothing else. And I guess if they ever think of socio-economic rights, it is in the sense that ultimately one day economic growth will solve our problems of inequality and poverty and so on. So in that first group, which is the private sector, I think there is no concern with or intention to think about socio-economic rights in a serious way. The second group I talk about is academia and economists in the academic sector, where I think there is some degree of differentiation. While the majority, I think it would be the majority of economists in the academic sector still subscribe to the Americanization of economics that has taken place over the last 50 years and see economics as a natural science akin to physics rather than as a social science. In that group of individuals, is no different in any significant way to the way that private sector economists think about it. Of course, there is, thankfully, also a progressive set of economists in the academic sphere who are thinking increasingly about issues of inequality, poverty, and unemployment, although they may not specify it in the socio-economic rights terminology that one would like to see. And one does have some concern about the influence of these progressive economists in the policy-making sphere. And it seems to, if you look at, for example, the latest policy document that emerges from the presidency, the Recovery and Restoration Plan, of course, there is the usual language about why we need to concern ourselves with inequality and unemployment and so on, but very little about a more progressive economic strategy to achieve those socio-economic rights. So the progressive economists, I mean, many of whom are sitting on this President's Economic Advisory Panel, have yet to show us what contribution they are making to the changing of government policy. And leading on from there, of course, there is government itself, where in our constitution prescribes socio-economic rights. But as in many other spheres, I regret to say that the government pays lip service to the achievement of socio-economic rights, and particularly in putting up front that the achievement of these socio-economic rights as they relate to unemployment and other things should be what economic policy has to be directed at. Instead, we really have had over the past quarter of a century, nothing more than an imitation of what private sector economists would love our economic policy to be all about. And so while the government, on the one hand, and I would not want to say lip service because I think that may be somewhat harsh, I would say it pays less than adequate attention to the question of socio-economic rights, it has bought into the notion that if you subscribe to a neoclassical stroke neoliberal economic policy, then ultimately these socio-economic rights will be achieved. Unfortunately, there's no time frame that the government gives us because a quarter of a century has passed. All of these indicators of socio-economic rights have intensified, have deepened, and we still, in fact, on many of these indicators, we are in a worse position than we were in 1994. Fortunately, I think there is some light on the horizon in terms of the work on socio-economic rights. And I think this is being done almost disproportionately, I think, by civil society, such as, for example, the Institute for Economic Justice. And I think that the most important thing that civil society is doing in this arena of socio-economic rights is to sensitize all of us to why there should be a greater link between economic policy and socio-economic rights. And I want to end there in this contribution because I think we need to be positive about this, although I have to say that the progress that we've made as a country on achieving this really basic socio-economic rights that the writers of the Constitution deemed appropriate seems a long, long way off. Thank you.
Thank you, Penny. So there's a question in the chat that comes from Michael Sachs, which is to say, aren't socioeconomic rights also a fundamentally liberal concept? And I think I sort of touched on that a little bit in my introduction, saying that often progressive economists are reticent to talk about rights or to integrate rights because of that very thing. You've now made a case here for why it's important. Could you maybe elaborate on why you think that they are so important in response to that point?
Well, I think in responding to Michael's question, I think they are liberal in a political sense, but not liberal or neoliberal in an economic sense, in the way that the liberals and the neoliberals have hijacked the political agenda, I think is quite different from what he's raising in terms of the notion of socio-economic rights per se being considered liberal.
Okay, great, thank you. So I think I'm just scrolling through the comments, and I think this is really sparked a few things. So perhaps one more question. There's a comment here from Dante, which says, South Africa has overlooked socioeconomic rights. In fact, broad-based Black economic empowerment legislation is an attempt to get to implementing socioeconomic rights to get the private sector to narrowly implement community development. How can we rectify this strategically and at a public policy level? Pandi, would you like to respond to that? Pandi, are you with us?
Sorry, I'm with you, yeah.
Okay. Did you hear that question?
No, I lost you for a moment.
Okay, so this person is saying that South Africa has overlooked socioeconomic rights and saying that policies like broad-based Black economic empowerment are an attempt to get the private sector to kind of narrowly implement community development or socioeconomic development. So if I'm understanding his question correctly, he's saying that there's a kind of outsourcing of those rights. You can correct me if I'm wrong. And he's saying, how do we rectify this strategically and at a public policy level? So I guess the broader question is, how do we get the government to take this responsibility seriously?
Well, my response to that would be, well, certainly broad-based Black broad-based economic empowerment in the form that it's being implemented, I would not characterize as an implementation of socio-economic rights because it is quite narrow. It is empowering a few at the expense of the many. And certainly that's not what at least in theory, the intention of that policy is. So I think if it were implemented differently, if it were really broad-based, then I think one could include it as an element of the kinds of socio-economic rights that we want implemented in the country. But I think the way it's turning out in practice is quite different from what those who wrote the legislation or those who designed the policy, I think, originally intended. There's a question by Zanele Sebanda in the chat about what is a progressive economist. Can I answer it?
Yes, absolutely, please do.
I hope I did not say that progressive economists are the same as private sector economists. I was intending to say that many of the neoliberal economists in academia are not so different from their counterparts in the private sector. My definition of a progressive economist would be someone who would pay much greater attention to the socio-economic challenges that we face in this country and how they could be resolved in the short term rather than as neoliberals see it as a policy that will deliver employment and so on and so forth in the long term, when, as a famous economist said, most of us will be dead.
Great, thank you so much. So at the end of your previous input, you spoke about implementation. So I think I'm going to switch gears and bring Basani and Jason into the conversation and talk about different ways, different tactics in which we can start to see and start to agitate for socioeconomic rights implementation in different ways. So in our, and this has already come up in the conversation, but in our research, we found, as I've said, that many economists, I think Pandi, you said exactly this, many economists, progressive economists, we just had a clarification about that, many progressive economists who care about issues of inequality, unemployment, poverty, and all the related ills are often necessarily talking about rights questions, but don't frame their research in those terms. And what I'd like to do is bring in Basani, who has done some research, because Basani is an economist, and she's done some research that has done this. So Basani, if you could join us. In our interview with you, you spoke about your Caring for the Carers project and explained to us how you used a rights framework. And you said to me, you didn't realize you were using a rights framework until you spoke to someone who said, hey, this is what you're doing. So could you talk a little bit about that process and how you used a rights framework in your research on this?
Hi, Cariee. Yes, and I'm still trying to figure this out, right? This rights framework. But for me, it came quite intuitively. So we had set up to do kind of like a scorecard of the health system, and where we would rate how, or we actually called it the gender inequality scorecard, where we would rate how workers are treated within the healthcare system by looking at, and so yeah, so we had a workshop of that with the healthcare worker partners that we were working with, and a number of issues came up, issues of on low pay, on extended working hours, of labor brokering, all the various kind of like poor working conditions that are quite subject to many workers in South Africa. And so through that, building from the scorecard, what we needed was to kind of like set about a criteria that would basically identify the extent to which particular health facilities are in fact meeting their legal obligations. I don't know if that's even the right term. I'm an economist, so basically that is what we were looking to do. And we had this report that looked at, you know, the Basic Conditions Employment Act, the LRA. It also looked at the ILO and also looked at the International Convention of Social and Economic Cultural Rights, to basically identify, okay, what should be the course of action? Okay, what are the minimum requirements? And then we bringing forth the evidence in terms of how far we are in implementing any of these things. And also looking at the extent to which there are also gaps within that those conventions themselves. So we didn't see the conventions or the rights or the claims, whatever you'd call it, the provisions by law as cast in stone. We also saw them as points of contest, especially for healthcare workers who are, in a way, because of the structural issues that face healthcare work, where you find more often than not that things that would be abnormal for many workers, like working a 24-hour shift, for instance, because they are having to do emergency work. Those become quite normalized within the healthcare sector because of particular provisions that basically say, no, if you are an emergency worker, then you are not allowed, then basically the you are not allowed like the normal kind of hours, the 8 to 5 or whatever. So there are a lot of gaps within that the legal framework that put healthcare workers on a bind, and that becomes heightened when we have this austerity when we have austerity measures, because there aren't enough healthcare workers in the system to ensure the quality of care that is required, partly because of austerity, and then to have to face a legal kind of like environment that basically does not cater to the nature of their work, then makes it, then worsens their working conditions. So that's how we ended up looking at it, and it was not based on an explicit kind of intent of using a human rights framework. It's just something that seemed quite intuitive. And then, of course, we tried to popularize those notions beyond just the report, but like actually going out into healthcare facilities to kind of talk about, what are the minimum standards, right? What are the rights that they can claim, and how, in terms of enforcement, that's not happening, but also what are the gaps within the rights framework that reproduce the inequality that they face. So yeah.
Great, thanks, Basani. I think it's really interesting, and Alison's point in the chat sort of partly links to what my follow-up question is. So Alison had said a great point from Basani that rights aren't set in stone, there are points of contestation. And she said it would be great to hear more reflection on strategies to push for a progressive, expansive, even radical interpretation of economic and social rights. And what I had said had planned to ask you was, what do you think the potential is for this kind of integration of rights and the kind of methodology that you've laid out? What is its potential to expand beyond sectoral issues? In other words, what's the possibility for using them to force a greater consideration of rights in questions of fiscal or monetary policy? And I think that what's really interesting is one of the things you said is about a kind of legal framework that is not catering to these workers' rights because they're healthcare workers. But what we know about human rights is that they're supposed to apply equally, right? And so how much of that was an important part of this research? I think in your interview, you said that a lot of employment legislation has these kind of loopholes that you can get through, right? And that part of the value in the rights frameworks is that we can use them to maybe plug some of these loopholes. So I'm wondering if you could just respond to that.
Okay, that's quite a, so, I was thinking of this question and within kind of like an advocacy strategy, right? How, within kind of like an advocacy strategy for me anyways, it makes sense to speak of rights in the concrete, right? To speak of the rights in the concrete, in the way in which people experience the impacts of inequality. So it's easier when we talk about a housing crisis, water crisis, and all that stuff. However, when we start talking about the instruments, the economic instruments at play, let's say monetary policy, to get us where we need to be in terms of housing delivery or water delivery and whatnot, I think that you cannot talk about that, like that kind of an instrument outside of the sectoral issue, for me anyways, if I was doing advocacy around the issue. There certainly has to be a point of connection. And perhaps Sandra could elaborate further, because I'm quite new to the International Convention, but like from a very brief kind of like reading of it, it seems to be far more explicit on the more sectoral issues. And then it talks about maximum resource availability. Now, what that is and what that means is highly contested within the economics field, right? And so where you would have people, for instance, who would be about inflation targeting, others not. And certainly, if we were to use that kind of a statute to kind of address these issues, it would, there would be quite a lot of contestation there, and it would be far more powerful if we were speaking about that within the questions of the impacts that it has on the sectoral issue. I don't know if that makes the more sectoral kind of impact. So not speaking about fiscal policy or monetary policy outside of that, and making the two connect, for me seems to be a far more powerful advocacy strategy. So I don't see it as one or the other.
No, absolutely. I think that's really interesting. And I think in the final session, we'll also loop back to some of the things that you said there about, making rights like contextual, using them to make people's struggles real and to make economic policy real to people and related to the issues that they experience. So I think that that's really important. Sandra, I'm not sure if you wanted to come in on Basani's point about that, or if you'd like to pick that up in the Q&A at the end. That would also be fine. Okay.
Yeah, so I mean, I think Basani's gave such a rich input, and really sort of showing the connections between the sort of austerity and the sectoral specific issues arising in health. And I mean, I would just make the brief point for this time that on the maximum available resources, I mean, she's absolutely right that it is a very contested area area, but I think internationally now, and with the help of, you know, many organizations, including the Center for Economic and Social Rights, you know, it's become to realize that maximum available resources is not only a defense for the state, but also imposes concrete obligations to mobilize the maximum of available resources, which also includes preventing the loss of resources through, for example, corruption or illicit financial flows and so forth. So I think that's one of the ways in which this bridge between maximum available resources and the concrete sectoral specific rights can be made. So thanks.
Great, thank you. Yes, Basani said she'd just like to come in with one more thing. Basani?
Yeah, just having said that, for me, I guess it's to say that these rights are there to be claimed, right? Or even expanded upon where we find gaps and loopholes. So the crucial part is where there is vagueness or whatever, that becomes, how that is interpreted becomes a question of the balance of forces. What are we doing in terms of movement building and interpretation, both within the economics field, if we are saying that we have such a small group of progressive economists, that for me is a crisis within the country, and certainly insofar as how we have seen South Africa not being as progressive as other countries, even in the West, in terms of in response to crisis, right? So it means, so there's far more. So yeah, for me, this is how I see it as a tool, but it's not an end in of itself. There's a lot in terms that is highly contested, and for which how we are able, the extent to which we are able to fill in the gaps where there is vagueness, that is an advocacy issue, that is a movement building issue, and that is a knowledge production issue. If we fail at that, there's definite stagnation or regression.
Great, thanks, Basani. So we've talked about kind of various strategies and advocacy in a way in this conversation, and I'm going to ask Jason to come in here and ask him about a kind of specific strategy that has been very prominent in South Africa, and that's like public interest, the way in which public interest law organizations have kind of what their strategies have challenged, how their strategies have challenged economic and budget policies to advance socioeconomic rights. So Jason, if you could give us a kind of overview of that and share some of your thoughts on that question.
Thanks, Cariee. So you're absolutely right. Public interest litigation around social rights in South Africa has received a lot of attention, especially internationally, with cases like Grootboom and the Treatment Action campaign case held out as exemplars, as examples of what's possible. But you know, the reality on the ground is much more nuanced, varied, variegated, granular than the 4 or 5 most famous cases that receive so much attention. And what's happening in our high courts on a daily basis, I think, is actually much more significant when it comes to social rights litigation around budgets and economic policy. We have a growing public interest sector, 3 generalist organizations that are about 40 years old, and now about 10 specialist public interest organizations that work on 1 or 2 specific areas, like Section 27, Equal Education Law Center, and so on. So the sector is growing and is really active across all of these areas of our society. And their work across these hundreds of cases has tackled economic policy and budgets, but it's tended to do that indirectly rather than directly and explicitly. So we go to court on behalf of clients or a community to make a particular claim for delivery of X, whether it's antiretroviral drugs or textbooks or building safe schools. And we get an order compelling the state to provide whatever that social good is. And that will inevitably have consequences for resources and quite often for budgeting. And there have been some occasions where the courts have explicitly ordered the state to budget to provide whatever the item is. So most recently during COVID, Scalabrini brought an application to extend the social relief of distress grants to foreign nationals, to asylum seekers and refugees, and they succeeded. And the court in deciding that case said to government, and you must also budget now for the additional expenditure for grants for foreign nationals. And that's happened on a couple of other occasions. But generally, this is just a consequence of a case rather than what the order is about. And one of the reasons for that is the way the state has litigated these cases. So the state has generally not put up detailed resource-based defenses in social rights cases. They put up a single paragraph, bold denial, saying that whatever civil society or a community is seeking will have negative resource or budget implications, but without really doing the work to explain to the court what those are. And as a consequence, the courts have dealt very quickly with those sorts of objections, and the courts haven't really been pulled into considering government spending priorities or budgeting priorities. And they've been able to use in particular a constitutional court decision in a case called Blue Moonlight that said it's not good enough for the state to say it hasn't budgeted for something if its constitutional obligations required it to have done so. So there's quite a strong dictum in that Blue Moonlight case, which has been very powerful for the public interest sector and has basically enabled, it's worked as a kind of fly swatter whenever this hollow resource-based defense is raised by the state. It can just be swatted away with that Blue Moonlight decision. And I think what we're starting to see though in civil society, in the public interest space and in conversations like this one is shifting from that fly swatter mentality to budgets and resources to thinking about them more like a beehive, if I can use that metaphor, where we all have to collectively nurture our resources, including the public interest sector. And the sector needs to be concerned about what the systemic effects are of litigating for textbooks or school buildings or whatever it may be. And one of the big gaps, I think, in having this conversation and moving forward is the lack of empirical research and interdisciplinary research. So my own research underway at the moment is on the education rights litigation, and I'm finding that it has had structural effects, including in relation to government's budgeting priorities and the priority accorded to education infrastructure before COVID. But we really need to be doing much more of this kind of research, and it will be done much more effectively by interdisciplinary teams, and especially by economists who wouldn't, like me, take 3 or 4 days to understand what's happened in relation to education expenditure, for example. And to pick up on something that Pandi Pillay said earlier, I think there's also a risk of Americanization and an over-reliance on American academic work in this space. So, for example, there's a recent book by Samuel Moyen which links rights, human rights, and neoliberalism and the growth in inequality. And I think that provides only a partial picture. I think a lot of the American-driven research is based on American paradigms, American conditions, a constitution that doesn't include social rights, that doesn't have a substantive conception of equality, that doesn't allow affirmative action very much at all, something we were talking about earlier. So I think this is one of the real needs, that we need to be doing this interdisciplinary empirical research that can draw absolutely on international work, but shouldn't have its agenda set by that work and shouldn't have its conclusions presumed by what has happened empirically in other countries.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I think there's been, some conversation in the chat, which I think leads somewhat to my next question, which was about the kind of possibilities and limitations of public interest litigation in tackling economic policy questions. And I think, there was a comment by Michael Sachs about, the Haitians didn't claim rights in the court, like they had more direct methods. And I think this is, a debate about what role public interest litigation can play and what role it can, and I think how it can feed into kind of other methods. So I'm wondering if you would like to kind of respond to that.
Yeah, so I think that's exactly the sort of conversation and inquiry we need to be having, but we really need to be looking at what has been attempted and what's worked in South Africa. And many of the things that we would suggest be attempted by public interest litigation in South Africa would be dead in the water in many other parts of the world. They wouldn't even be worth talking about or attempting. And you'd need to try other routes, whether it's the legislative route, lobbying the executive, protest action. And those methods are also all available in South Africa. And for me, a really interesting inquiry would be, how effective have some of those different methods been in comparison to public interest litigation, without assuming the answer, so with an open mind. So I think, for example, an interesting comparison between Fees Must Fall, which at times used rights language, but certainly didn't use the courts. So comparing that kind of movement and campaign, which achieved massive change in relation to spending priorities, and comparing it, for example, to the Norms and Standards campaign by Equal Education, different kind of campaign, different aims. And over a long term, what will we see across those two areas? And that question could be expanded across all of the service delivery protests that we see in South Africa all the time. Which ones have succeeded in securing something for communities, which ones haven't? And comparing that to public interest litigation. I think there are some really important studies to be done there.
Great, thank you. So kind of building on a lot of these conversations, I'm gonna try to ask everyone on the panel to respond to this. So we sort of asked a lot of people about the various strategic entry points for expanding the use of rights in economic policy and expanding the role of economics in human rights. And what we kind of found in our research is that, people felt that for progressive economists, human rights can clarify what a human-centered policy agenda looks like. And that's because people felt that what human rights does, and especially socioeconomic rights, is it puts objectives front and center when you are thinking about questions of resource allocation. So instead of having objectives being something like economic growth, you have a different set of objectives and you gear your economic policy very clearly towards these. And that human rights can also allow for a clearer explication of the weaknesses in mainstream economics, which, as Pandi said at the beginning, likes to present itself a lot of the time as value neutral. And what we kind of know now is that it's not value neutral, it just has a kind of different value system from the one that a human rights centered framework would put forward. And this can help to make progressive economic policy more real. And I think that's something that Basani kind of was speaking about there, is because human rights are dynamic and they're quite intuitive. I think a lot of the time when you speak about human rights, not in a legalistic language, but in a way that is about, people have a right to food, I think people feel intuitively that that's correct. And when you link that to economic policy, it can make the kind of things that we're calling for much more intuitive. And for human rights practitioners, a kind of better understanding of economics can allow for a deeper understanding of the systemic nature of human rights violations. So one of the major criticisms that we heard throughout our interviews was that, people are very much in the human rights community tend to be quite focused on individual violations, and that this understandably evolves out of the fact that the human rights paradigm was for a very long time concerned primarily with civil and political rights, rather than second generation socio-economic cultural rights. And so a kind of better understanding of economics allows us to push push the boundaries of that. And it can deepen and broaden the scope of your activism as a result. So what I'd like to do is kind of ask our panelists to respond to the question of where they see the most promising strategic entry points to expand the intersection of human rights and economics. And I think one of the strategic entry points that I'll maybe ask Basani to speak a little bit more about is about this making this real. One of the things that a number of interviewees said was that a question like the climate crisis allows for a greater expansion of the role of the intersection of socio and economic rights. So Basani, if you'd like to respond on that strategic question first, and then we'll ask the rest of the panelists to come in.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, like as I mentioned prior, it's around how you can take the more concrete lived experiences of people, right? In which case, I mean, you can, in the example I used were healthcare workers, where they, and then kind of use that as a strategic frame or strategic tactic around talking, for instance, on issues of austerity or the like. So, I mean, within what we kind of like went into that position, or that when we were speaking to healthcare workers, in trying to unpack what is the conflict basically between healthcare workers and patients. And often that is understood within, you know, healthcare workers are lazy, they're not doing their jobs, and da-da-da-da. And once you start kind of unpacking the structural issues that surround that, right, it then shifts you into issues of, for instance, universal healthcare, the need for greater availability of resources and the like. So for me, as I mentioned before, it is in thinking about the lived experiences of people. So taking a very grounded approach as a way of building into the more kind of like structural impediments that are not particularly observable, however, are coded in various ways, whether it's in law or in the way in which fiscal policy is conceived. So that for me becomes how you catalyze those types of bigger questions in moving to a more progressive lens on, you know, whether it's the human rights framework lens that many people cannot even claim to understand or know, simply because of the way in which it's so removed from their own language. And so that's how I find connection.
Great, thank you, Basani. Pandi, would you like to come in on that question of strategic entry points?
Sure, but can I respond to a few other things or not?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes, you can.
I think Sandra made the point that we should include the right to work in the Constitution, like we have the right to education. Well, I think we can include it there, but does it matter is the more important question, because the right to basic education and the right to basic healthcare is entrenched in the Constitution. But as far as education is concerned, for example, this right to basic education is not protected for tens of thousands of young people who leave the system before they even get to matric. So, I mean, one can put it there, but does it matter is the more important question. The second is about 2 points that were made by Alison Cariee. The first one is she calls for a progressive, expansive, even radical interpretation of social and economic rights. I think this is a wonderful idea, but again, my question would be, would it matter? Because this has been done. You know, somebody in the chat refers to the book by Padiachi and Fanikek, Shadow of Liberation, where the merge strategy is expanded in detail about how it was rejected even before the ANC government came into power. So while this is a laudable thought, where will it go is the question. And the second point that Alison makes, I think, is really important. And the one is that instead of focusing on macroeconomic policy, shouldn't we focus on structural transformation and then decide what kind of macroeconomic policy? Right now, macroeconomic policy, and I see that Michael Sachs is objecting to our, what he calls, or what he suggests is our obsession with fiscal and monetary policy. I think it's a justifiable obsession. That it's clear that macroeconomic policy is not delivering structural transformation. And of course, as Alison points out, the sequence of this is possibly inappropriate. Now, coming to your question, Cariee, about entry points, I think that I'd like to make 2 points. The one is that we really need to think differently in terms of policy about how we can have significant economic transformation. I won't use the dirty R word here, but I'll talk about significant economic transformation because it is not happening. I think it is fair to ask of a government that has been in power for this long, what are you actually doing to realize the socio-economic rights that are clearly defined in the Constitution? And I think the fair answer to that is very little. And so I don't think it's inappropriate to talk about socio-economic rights rather than carry on as if macroeconomic policy, including monetary policy, can deliver us the socio-economic rights that are so clearly defined both in the Constitution and in subsequent legislation. I think that doesn't have to be a long-term thing. It doesn't have to be another 2.5, 3 decades before we start thinking about socio-economic rights in a more serious way. The second point I want to make, which is about how economics is taught and how it is regarded in universities. We think of economics, as I said earlier, largely as if it is a natural science. As I said, thinking in terms of mathematics and physics. If you can't do mathematics, economics is not for you. And so we've lost the notion that economics is by definition about society, and hence it is a social science. It is not a natural science. And it seems to me that much more needs to be done in terms of integrating the study of economics with social sciences, particularly political science and sociology, where there is a greater acknowledgement and acceptance of the important role of socio-economic rights in the development of our society. Now, whether that will happen is open to question, because as one of our colleagues said earlier, when we think about economics teaching and economic policy making, we look north. We don't look north of the Zambezi, but we look north across the Atlantic, because that's where we must learn our economics from. That's where the models we must emulate, because we want to be like the US of A and Europe and so on and so forth. So it seems to me that if we want to have a serious discussion about the realization of social economic rights, economic policy has to change. And with it, the way in which we teach economics in universities, in colleges, and so on, has to undergo a fundamental change to what has happened in the last 50 or so years. Thank you.
Thank you, Pandi. I think that was great. I also think your earlier points were also actually around strategy, so they fitted in well. So Jason, I'm going to ask you to come in and respond to that question about strategy. And I'm also going to say that in the chat, I think it was Tundi Matthews who said, what are the roles of affected communities in determining the parameters of a budget beyond the NGIization and institutionalization of rights? And I think what's interesting there is that in your interview, you raised the point that, with litigation, we've often seen the importance of movement-based litigation. I think that's the correct term. So I was wondering if you could speak about that and speak about, whether you think that is a kind of key strategy in this.
Yeah, so thanks, Cariee. And it's an important, crucial point that Tundi raises about who has the power and who's driving these agendas. And is it NGOs, is it lawyers? To what extent do communities have meaningful roles to play in determining budget policy and government policy as a whole? And I suppose what I'd start by saying is that there isn't one way to do public interest litigation. Movement lawyering is sometimes set up as the ideal model, sometimes as a kind of Rolls Royce, but it's not always the most effective or most appropriate way. There are other models, models that center on a public campaign, a media-driven campaign, or models that are based much more on clients and communities, driven on the ground, but without some kind of visible national movement. And so when you think about, for example, refugee rights work, in a lot of that work, a national movement isn't really going to take off in current conditions. So there isn't one way to do it. And questions of agency and power are really important in the decisions about how public interest litigation is done. In terms of strategic entry points, and subject to what I've said, and subject to the important point that public interest litigation isn't the only strategy, and it's often not the best strategy, but in terms of entry points for litigation, I think there are a number of principled issues that are very contestable at the moment. And one of them is zero-based budgeting in relation to social rights, so in relation to health, housing, education, and so on. And if zero-based budgeting is being applied in ways that amount to retrogression, in other words, moving backwards in relation to the realization of social rights, then I think it could well be up for challenge. I think the processes around budgeting and the room for communities and civil society to participate, and to call for human rights impact assessments before austerity-based cuts are made, I think are potentially really valuable entry points. And then finally, I think the point has been made a few times by Basani in particular, that these questions are best resolved and these struggles are best fought around a concrete issue. And so even if we're going to tackle zero-based budgeting or the processes, that's best done in a concrete case. And I think just to give two examples that I think may be ripe for it, the issue of gender-based violence. A series of government publicly stated commitments to address gender-based violence, but to what extent does the budget reflect and give effect to that apparent political commitment? And if it doesn't, is there room for us to call on the basis of the Constitution for a more effective budgetary allocation? And the second is education infrastructure, where we saw, I mentioned, significant shifts to prioritize school infrastructure over the last decade, and I think prompted in particular by public interest litigation, and I think that can be shown, but now recently massive cuts to the education infrastructure budget. So those are two concrete issues. I think in this group we could probably come up with another 5 or 6 or 10 really core issues at the moment, where we'd be able to also tackle the more principled questions of the relationship between social rights and the budget.
Great, thanks, Jason. Sandy, can I bring you in to answer that question about strategies, and then hopefully we can then shift to the very many questions that have been raised in the chat.
Yeah, thanks, Cariee, and thanks for that conversation and the questions. I just want to revisit, and it's not that I'm disagreeing with Jason, but I would just perhaps unsettle the notion that necessarily the best way is to start once on an issue where a rights violation has already occurred. Because although I agree that has got a lot of mobilizing potential, and for the courts, it would also sort of bring up a very concrete issue. At that point, it is a bit like closing the stable door after the horse has bolted. And as I understand, the purpose of this convening is partially also to look at how do we upfront deal with those economic policy, macroeconomic issues that generate those outcomes. And then it links to, Basani's point, and also it allows, for a more holistic, you're not dealing with only certain rights or certain groups. One can look holistically and at an integrated framework, for all rights realization for everyone. So I think that, this engagement upfront with macroeconomic policy is very important, as opposed to simply, an issue-based, but of course it doesn't have to be an either or, so how we can sort of use both strategies. Regarding, the mobilizing potential, I mean, I really do think, there's many different levels on which one could tackle this, but I do think, and building on the research that has been done by many others, the movement building, economic literacy campaigns, the way TAC had sort of treatment literacy campaigns, and the same would apply to have lawyers, sort of made more economically literate and economists made more human rights literate. I think that would be, equally important. I think many of the comments that Pandey makes about economists and economics education is also very, very much relevant to legal education, where public law is siloed off from private law, where many of the crucial distributional decisions are made, whether in tax law, in contract law, in law of property, and so forth. So that sort of bridging is very important. And then I think, yes, as I mentioned at the start, I think on retrogression, you could find particularly the conditions which the UN committee and even our courts have accompanied with retrogression of proportionality, of participation, of non-discriminatory impact, could be a very important strategic entry point. And then I think, the issues to me that seem very ripe for addressing are the questions of more participation in economic and budgetary decision making. So, the Open Budgetary Partnership has ranked South Africa very high on the transparency of its budgetary processes, but very low on participation. And that goes both into the front end of actually the executive policy making process, the parliamentary process, and then the implementation and auditing and monitoring processes, and applies also through all spheres of government. So I think participatory budgeting can create those spaces where many of the concepts and many of the visions that we've articulated could have an influence. So yes, I'll rest at there. Thanks, Cariee.
Thanks, Sandy. So I'm going to ask you to stay, because I think what we're going to do is try to switch to some of the questions that were there. And I think one of the ones that we had very early on from Tundi was noting South Africa's advantage in terms of having a progressive constitution that protects socio and economic rights. Do you think human rights and the minimum core has become a crutch for the state to not restructure the economy? In other words, that the conceptualization of human rights in state policy complements a neoliberal market economy. And I think that's a really important question, and I'd like you, if you have some responses to that.
Yes, thanks very much. I do, and it is a very important question. And, you know, I agree with a lot of the critique of, you know, Samuel Moyne's book, Not Enough, you know, being within a primarily northern, global northern sort of perspective and not taking into account many of the developments in the global south. But having said that, I really do think there is something to what he says about a minimalist sufficiency paradigm of human rights being inadequate to tackle global inequalities or the absolute burgeoning of inequality, economic inequalities and wealth inequalities. And, you know, some of the more minimalist, survivalist counts of, you know, minimum core and that, I think, play into that kind of discourse. And I don't think human rights will speak to these major structural issues of global inequality unless we also, you know, expand. I think that's what a lot of the chat was about, what Alison mentioned about how do we develop more radical notions of rights that respond to these crises of climate change, global inequality, the era of pandemics, racial inequality, and so forth. So I think that is something that I would like us to grapple with more, because, you know, as soon, you know, speaks to the question of power. As soon as you have these huge wealth inequalities, it doesn't matter if you've got a minimum core, provided you still continue to generate the structural conditions where some have, you know, are able to reinforce their position, exercise disproportionate political influence, and control the economy. So I think that's, you know, for me, a very important point, that we need to, you know, rights concepts are malleable, and they have to be infused with progressive content. They can also be used in regressive ways. And I think the challenge for us as progressive economists and lawyers is to work out how to develop these tools in a way that furthers an agenda of social justice. Thanks.
Absolutely, thank you. I think that definitely does speak to what Basani spoke about a lot, and I think Alison also said in the chat about kind of pushing for a more radical notion of rights. There was also a question from Claire, which maybe Jason would be well placed to answer, which is, what is the human rights perspective, if any, on the idea of exploitation? So exploitation in the workplace is a violation of human rights, or is there any kind of scholarship or jurisprudence on this in international law?
It's an important question, Cariee, and I think it's an area that has really been neglected by civil society as a whole and the public interest sector over the last decade or two. Workers' rights. 40 years ago, trade union activity and workers' rights were locked into human rights advocacy and work in the dying days of apartheid. But in the last 10 or 20 years, the trade union sector has drifted, it's splintered, it's much weaker than it used to be. And the public interest sector, in turn, has not prioritized workers' rights. So there's a lot going on. There are many, many cases every day which are contesting exploitation on a micro level. Many workers go unrepresented through the CCMA and even into the Labour Court, or at best they have some trade union representation, and if they're very lucky, they have representation by a firm like Cheadle Thompson Haysom. But it's a big gap. I think it's one of the areas that we've neglected, and it's the workers' rights, really neglected area.
Great, thank you. And perhaps as a follow-up to that, which you might be well placed to answer as well, was there was a question which was directed at Sandy, which is about the right to work. So our constitution does not expressly entail a right to work, but it's very prevalent in international instruments, right? So in the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, I know there is a whole lot on the right to work and the right to kind of just and favorable conditions of work. And so the question here was, would this be and I think Pandi also spoke to this, where he said, what would be the point? What's the point of including a right to work if we have these rights there, but nothing happened, but we don't see a kind of realization of those rights. So I guess the question is about what do you see as the status of the right to work in South Africa, and what kind of role would an enshrined right to work play?
So first of all, the state of South African law, we do have in Section 23 a right that protects against unfair labor practices and unfair dismissals, but it doesn't include the positive right to work. It's still a very important right, and there's been a lot of activity around issues like labor brokers and more recently platform workers, Uber and so on, whether they constitute employees, whether they're entitled to protection, because we have a whole lot of legislation that sets up minimum standard protection for workers, most crucially the Basic Conditions of Employment Act, which deals with things like working hours, leave, and so on. So there's some protection for existing employees, and you really need to be in that employee category to get the best of that protection. At the international level, there's a more expansive right to work, and the ILO, the International Labour Organization, is the key international body with a number of treaties, many of which South Africa is party to, which again protect a lot of the rights of workers. But even at the international level, the right to work doesn't guarantee employment. It's not a right to a job, just as the right to housing is often not understood as a right to be provided with a house on demand necessarily. But again, I would say, yes, right to work, and link that to the issue of basic income grant, which is very topical in South Africa. I think the two are related. And I think it's something we need to be giving much more attention to, but that's more or less the state of play as I understand it.
Can I chip in there, Cariee?
Absolutely, please do.
Yeah, so, I mean, as Pandi was saying, sort of what's the point? I mean, in the same, rights don't, sort of the right to education hasn't been realized in practice. So I think, rights then link to opportunities to realize those rights and to promote greater accountability. Someone in the chat mentioned the provision in the Constitution, I think it's 237, about charters of rights, which was put in the Constitution as a sort of catch-all for rights that were forgotten, although what the status of that would be and how it could be used is unclear, but it could be an opportunity then to reimagine what we mean about work. And Basani's presentation also about the care work, women's work in the home, and valuing that, different forms of livelihoods and the protection that they enjoy, so it actually then opens up a whole conversation to give content to that right and to link them to accountability mechanisms. So that's what I would say would be the point of a right to work.
Great, thank you. So I'd like to bring in Pandi and then also Basani to this, and to talk about, there's been a couple of questions and comments in the chat. This question of social goods, how are social goods provisioned? Also a point about how resourcing healthcare has less to do with fiscal policy, that we don't need to spend more on health, we just need to redistribute health resources better. And this came up a lot in our interviews, primarily with people talking about education. And Pandi, you may have said this as well, that South Africa actually spends quite a large proportion of our budget on education in comparison comparison to comparable countries, and yet we have much worse outcomes. So that this question is not always just about allocating more money. It's not just always about increasing budgets. It's actually about redirecting economic policy, perhaps in a rights way, somewhat differently. So Pandi, could you maybe come in and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. I think the points being made about expenditure on education and healthcare are absolutely spot on. Whether you compare ourselves with other middle-income countries or whether you compare ourselves with the rest of the African continent, we're way ahead in how much we spend on education and health. So I think without doubt, there's an efficiency question there, that we're spending all this money, but what are we getting for it? And the question in education, which I'm more familiar with, is very little. When you're spending 20% of your budget on one sector, you would think that the outputs and outcomes in education would be way above what they have been and continue to be. And the COVID-19 epidemic also exposed what many of us knew already about the public health sector, where here again, we're spending a huge amount of money and we're not getting what we should be getting in terms of outcomes. Now, if one wants to couch this in socio-economic rights terms, I think it's correct that the socio-economic rights that relate to the provision of basic education and basic healthcare are clearly not being realized. And it's not a budgetary question, it's not a money question, it's an implementation question. And we have to ask ourselves, when will this get better? Because there is no indication whatsoever that, and I speak on education, that things are getting any better in terms of the outcomes if you just leave it at the level of primary and secondary education. Now, if I may take the liberty to make one other point, if I may, is that okay?
Absolutely.
And it may be considered a treasonable offense to say this, but I think that everywhere you go, people tell you in South Africa, our constitution is the most progressive and the best in the world. Well, not all elements, in my view, of the constitution are actually progressive. And I'll just give one example, monetary policy, for example. The fact that what we can do around monetary policy is so constrained and left to the whims of the central bank is actually preventing an effective solution to the current economic crisis. And you have to ask ourselves, why in a generally, and I would agree, in a generally progressive constitution, why was so much power given to the central bank? Why was the independence of the central bank even conceived or thought about when so many developing economies of the world don't have this? Again, it's a consequence of our look north policy, and let's do what is considered respectable by those countries. And I think this continues to affect the way in which we design and implement economic policy, because we look to the IMF, the World Bank, the rating agencies. These are the institutions that have taken over effective macroeconomic policy in this country, and hence the capacity to do anything about putting socio-economic rights up front, I think, is actually quite minimal. Thanks.
Thank you. Basani, I'm going to ask you to come in on that question, because I also think that, Sandra has just put in the chat that, part of the point that Pandi is making is that resources are not simply financial resources, but also human resources, about building and capacitating the public sector. And I think that works very well with the research that you're doing and the work that you're doing with care workers.
Yes, I would agree that there is a redistribution problem we seem to be a country that is okay with the fact that, you know, we have tripled the number of ICU beds or whatever in the private healthcare sector that serves 8 million people, and less than that in the public healthcare sector serving many. And we seem to be okay with the fact that, you know, given that deep resource divide within the thrust and the throes of a pandemic, we would still be requisitioning the critical infrastructure that would be required in the private healthcare sector by, you know, paying 16,000 Rand per bed per day or whatever. Whereas in other countries, such as Spain, they would have it that no, in fact, we need to use these resources. This is a pandemic, and therefore this should be cost-free, right? So there definitely is a redistribution issue there, and others would argue the fact that, you know, we have these medical tax credits that are basically subsidizing the private healthcare sector, and if they were not there, then we'd increase our healthcare budget by 60%, for instance. That is a redistribution issue. However, when you look at of late, specifically within the healthcare sector, you see there have been these cuts that have been happening to the extent that some of the commitments that we've made internationally in terms of the amount of expenditure to GDP, we seem to be declining in that, right? So to think of it as not a fiscal issue, I think for me becomes quite, I mean, for me, I think it's really up for contestation, especially when you see how the types of freezes, right, that are happening, the kinds of strategies that are then in operation to cost contain, such as employing less qualified healthcare workers of particular levels or grades, and for particular, you know, kinds of operations, but then employing those who are less qualified, just to ensure that you are meeting the targets, because there is the 60% or whatever compensation freeze, right? And that's how you cost contain. For me, speaks to a budgeting process that is not about in response to the needs, right? That is concomitant to the needs of society, where we have this quadruple burden of healthcare distress, but rather is responsive to particular budgetary requirements. So, so I feel that there is a tension there. I do think that there is a redistribution issue, there is a governance issue, but then we cannot just see that as the only cause outside of the fiscal issues, especially how we've seen it over the last few years. Thanks.
Thanks, Basani. Unfortunately, we're running out of time here, so I'm going to just ask if any of the panelists have any closing remarks that they'd like to make, and if they do, to try to keep these to about a minute. I know that's very difficult. Does anyone want to come in with any closing points? Final words. Yes, Jason.
Just a quick one. So I think it's in response really to a post by Shaira Kala higher up in the chat, quoting Tsepo Madlingozi. And it's basically picking up on the fact that if South Africa continues as it does, human rights just doesn't speak to the majority of the population in any meaningful way. And civil society, public interest litigation, all loses meaning and credibility. And there's an urgency there. You know, the poverty and inequality in South Africa pose an existential challenge to society as we know it, to civil society. And unless the Constitution can speak to the conditions of the majority of the people in an urgent and meaningful way, it is going to lose its normative power that we claim it has. So I just wanted to and I'm optimistic that it can, but it isn't self-executing. The Constitution doesn't implement itself. That falls to communities, to people, to civil society.
Great, thank you, Jason. Would anyone else like to come in with some final closing comments? Speak now or forever hold your peace. Okay, great, thank you. So I'm going to hand over now to, I think this was a really, really rich conversation, and I'd like to thank everyone for their contributions in the chat. I'm really sorry if I missed people's questions because there was just so much coming through there. We'll definitely be taking a record of these questions and trying to integrate them into future conversations, future webinars, or other conversations that we have, because I think they're really, really very valuable in guiding this work. I'm going to hand over now to Ignacio Saez, who is the Executive Director at the Center for Economic and Social Rights, which is one of our partner organizations that we've worked a lot on this with. And we're just going to ask him to kind of give a reflection on this from the perspective of CSR. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Cariee, and thank you to everyone. This has been an extremely rich and stimulating discussion, and it's been such a pleasure to listen to leading activists and practitioners in South Africa working at the intersections of economics and human rights. So many of the threads of this conversation really resonate with the work that we've been doing at the center. And they help to illuminate why the powerful potential of human rights to inspire systemic economic transformation, why that potential is still largely untapped. And I think there were some real insights into what needs to be done to remedy that. I'm not going to try and attempt a summary of what has been an incredibly rich discussion, but things that particularly resonated with us are, the need to move beyond a human rights practice that merely diagnoses symptoms of economic injustice towards a more structural human rights critique of the systems that reproduce that injustice. The need to guard against a very minimalist reading of international human rights law, and to embrace a more expansive understanding of the radical and redistributive orientation of economic and social rights. A strong thread was the need for a much more interdisciplinary practice that navigates the tensions and disjunctions between law, economics, social science, a practice that really enables more cross-sectoral alliances for economic and social justice, and I would add environmental justice, and a practice that values the expertise, or values as expertise, the lived experience of people living in poverty and inequality. So I think this conversation has been tremendous as a model of how to start building that economic literacy, building economics literacy amongst the human rights community, but also building rights literacy within the broader economic justice field. There is clearly such a need for us to interrogate and examine the biases and shortcomings within our own fields, which very often is baggage that we come with uncritically. So we really can help each other to explore how we overcome these. So just to say, the center is not a South African organization, although we're delighted to have Alison Corkery, who's our Director of Strategy based in Joburg, which has really facilitated the partnership with IEJ and with Section 27 and other South African organizations. But the reason why we're so excited to be part of this conversation is it's a discussion of global relevance and global urgency. Cariee, you mentioned that it's a bit of a cliche to talk about the pandemic, and indeed it is, but we're seeing that in countries across the globe, the economic fallout of the COVID-19 pandemic has really, it's made dramatically clear the connections between economics and human rights. And we've also seen in country after country how it's galvanizing debate and mobilization around the need to reshape our economies. So for us, it's really a critical moment of opportunity to explore the role that human rights standards, human rights strategies, human rights discourse can play in refounding our economies on a different set of values and shifting some of those narratives that have kept the zombie orthodoxies of neoliberalism alive and well. And we really believe this moment is crying out for a bolder and more propositional vision of what a rights-based economy would look like. 10 days ago, we issued a publication with the international development NGO Christian Aid, sketching out a very preliminary articulation of that vision of a rights-based economy as a starting point, merely as a starting point for these kind of cross-sectoral conversations that this is such a great example of. Really would encourage you to look at that publication. We'll put the link in the chat and would very much welcome your feedback on it. And maybe lastly, just to say that this conversation for us is one of a number of global conversations that we're connected to, we're trying to foster. And without, we believe these discussions have to be contextualized, and there are a number of speakers in interventions today focused on how unuseful it is, or how sometimes it can be an obstacle to have paradigms and research and analysis that comes from a different context. So we don't want to sacrifice that domestic specificity, but at the same time, we believe this is a moment that needs kind of cross-fertilization across different national and regional experiences. So we're also engaged in debates with allies in Latin America on how to bring the concept, which has been discussed a lot today, of maximum available resources, how to really bring that to bear politically in fiscal responses to the COVID crisis. We're engaged with activists in North Africa about how to use evidence of the human rights impacts of austerity measures, for example, how we can use that to push for a paradigm shift in the policies and practices of IFIs, of international financial institutions like the IMF, that plays such a key role in determining and shaping economic policy. And indeed, the transition here in the US, the longed for transition, is also a new opening to change the paradigm of government policy, and perhaps the paradigm of academic thinking here in the US, as Jason flagged. So to me, this discussion today has highlighted that there is no more fertile context for these kinds of discussions and connections to be made than in South Africa, where you all in the human rights and economic justice movements have been grappling perhaps more than in any other country with the challenges and the contradictions of giving effect to a very progressive economic and social rights framework within a regressive neoliberal economic and social policy context. So this isn't for us a one-off conversation, it's an ongoing process of critical reflection that can really help to cement those much needed linkages across different communities of practice and across different geographies. It's clear that if we continue to work in our fragmented silos, disciplinary or geographical, we're not going to make the headway that we need to make in really shifting the power asymmetries that are at play here. And there's a very real risk that this narrow window of opportunity will close shut, just as it did after the global financial crisis. So just to end with a warm appreciation and word of thanks to IEJ and Section 27 for co-organizing this, or allowing us to co-organize this with you, and to the panelists, to Sandy, Basani, Pandi, Daniel, and Jason, and to all of you involved in the organization. We're really delighted to be joining forces with you on this, and look forward to seeing how we can work more closely to leverage the power of human rights to bring about more just economies. Thank you.
Thanks, Ignacio. I think that is a really good place to end the discussion. And I'd like to thank you for giving such a rich reflection on the discussion in general. Also want to thank the panelists who contributed to this much needed debate, and also to the participants who kept the chat box buzzing with comments and questions. It's always refreshing to have participants who are engaged in the topic of discussion. So yeah, as the IEJ, we hope to continue this conversation further through various channels and to continue working with the people here and the organizations here, and also those who haven't been able to make it. So yeah, I would like to end the conversation. Thank you so much. We'll be seeing some of you on Wednesday and Thursday at the convening. So thank you so much. And bye everyone.